evolutionists have discovered materialistic processes with
義務棒
demonstrating creative
こ
power.
こですよ、母親がしょっ
Grounds
ちゅ
for
う言っ
thinking
て
that
る
such processes do exist, though we do not
母親
need
が
to prove methodological naturalism or justify methodological naturalism by
月に
waiting
何
for
回
the
か行
policy.
く言って
Nor
る
do they need to declare their commitment to waiting indefinitely for an adequate materialistic evolutionary explanation for the origin of biological novelty to emerge. And that goes double for the
も
origin
う
of life
光にいる
itself. Instead,
頃
the
か
fact that
ら
they
やって
cannot
まし
justify
た
their confidence in some materialistic evolutionary processes will ultimately prove sufficient
40
to explain
年
the
ぐらい
origin of novelty means that they don't know that there is a gap in our knowledge of such process. That is, of an actual process at work in nature either now or in the past. Indeed, they have no grounds for believing the existence of causal powers of such a hypothetical process. Which is the very principle they seek to justify by invoking the specter of the god of the gap's objection. Conclusion: we have seen that there are no neutral methodological criteria by which we can define science normatively and exhaustively. But fruitful science does not need definitions, it needs creativity, hard work, and evidence most of all. We have also seen that specific demarcation criteria fail to distinguish the scientific status of materialistic and design-based theories of biological origins. That is, the proposed justifications in support of methodological naturalism fail. In addition, we have seen that there's a strong affirmative reason to reject methodological naturalism, namely that it hinders the truth-seeking function of science by forcing science to reject the possibility that creative intelligence played a discernible role in the origins of history of life, even before experience can freely testify. Methodological naturalism gives nothing to scientists but intellectual bondage and limited options. Even if the authors of this chapter were atheists, we would not want to work with the chains of methodological naturalism around our ankles. Nor should theistic evolutionists. They will lose nothing by letting go of this wretchedly bad rule, erasing a philosophical boundary that never should have been drawn in the first place. But whether they do so or not, it should now be clear that there is no compelling reason to accept methodological naturalism and every good reason to reject it. Consequently, there is no reason to continue holding to theistic evolution in the face of the mounting evidential difficulties that now confront all theories of unguided evolution. It may well be time to consider alternative types of causal explanations for the origin and development of life. To consider, for example, the possibility, at least, of an origin. Basketball is better than the three-point. So there. The demarcation problem, what is science, is particularly thorny, and many people say can't be solved. It does not make philosophical sense to try to rule out intelligent design by trying to prove it is not science, when you can't even define science well. It also does not make philosophical sense, that's my mistake, to assume naturalism is true and use that assumption to rule out the supernatural. That's why the term of methodological naturalism is invented. It was supposed to be neutral philosophically, but insisting on methodological naturalism is precisely philosophical naturalism. Ruling out God of the gap's argument is only fair if one knows there is no God, or that God will not interfere, which makes ruling out those arguments circular. But that's my opinion. Now it's your turn. So we have a couple of questions here and a couple of them here. Let me pass that back.
Just a historic incident. When I became pastor of the Madison Wisconsin Church and my wife was working on her doctorate at the university, Ron Numbers was there as well. He issued a public challenge to any creationists that he would debate and demolish them. Well, we rose to the challenge, found a creationist, no longer recall, and prepared for the debate. Ron Numbers backed out. He said he wanted nothing more to do with Seventh-day Adventists.
Interesting. That's coming back there.
Thank you. I was very interested in what determines the line of demarcation. To me, it appears that the two books that were referenced, primarily the Bible and the Origin of Species, are misunderstood, misinterpreted, and misused, beginning with Genesis chapter 1, where it says that God created, or He created Elohim, not God created the heavens and the earth when you read the Hebrew. You start off with a whole new, you pivot on the entire interpretation of the Bible. Also, the Origin of Species was meant to help people to understand the means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races. That's the original title of the book. The title was changed to help more people to accept the concept that he was actually trying to convey. So the misuse of the Bible, the misuse of this book, not as bad as the misinterpretation of the information that's inside of each book. The misinterpretation of what's inside of the Bible, when you read the Hebrew, starts off with, we don't know the age of the earth, don't argue over it. We don't know the origins of many things, but we know that our Father created the heavens and the earth, but there was destruction, and then there was the creation of Adam and Eve. So he recreated the heavens and the earth so that they were habitable for us. Just so many other things to consider.
Well, the discussion actually doesn't center around that particular point, though. What they're asking is, can God intervene in nature or do things differently than he usually does, or however you want to phrase that? And that's the real question. And methodological naturalism says we have to do science as if he doesn't. And philosophical naturalism says he doesn't because he doesn't exist. Theistic evolution, that is not unequivocally says he doesn't because he can't interfere in the laws he already created. And those are reasonable positions to start with, but then you have to start explaining data. And to rule out the idea that he does before you even look at the data is really allowing philosophy to override the evidence. And that's really what these people are talking about. One of them believes that there's been a long time before the biblical story of Adam and Eve. Another one believes there's been perhaps 6 days or 5 days, whatever it comes out to be, before the story of Adam and Eve. But they both understand that philosophical point, and that is that God can intervene in nature. And really, that principle, if I can put it that way, basically tries to make science safe for atheism. And I don't think that's the function of scientific rules. Comment over here. I'm thinking a couple up there.
I just read it. Faculty here there's very little to argue against in this presentation here. It's I tend to agree with almost everything there. I wonder a little bit. Obviously, materialistic observation period is very uninteresting. You just have a few facts and you can't speculate because you're out of observation. Very dull science if you're just putting leaves on a tree and can't say anything about it. And so this science, they don't follow materialistic naturalism. They go beyond that, and that's what makes science interesting. So you open the door, and then you start dealing with speculation against truth. That's something you need to watch once you open that door. Now, scientists claim that they kept that door closed and they're deceiving themselves. This is not the case. But it is something that you can watch as you open this door. That definitely might be speculation. Metaphysical ideas and so on can go very wild. And it seems to me that you tend to come back to more solid facts. I would say for animism, I certainly would like more solid facts and so on. What is the game? It's not defining science by material. Naturalistic materialism, that's not the game. What is the game? For finding truth. And is it, I tend to say, we fall back in observation. I tend to fall back in observation as a game. Because that data seems, that's more reliable, more consistent than random speculation, metaphysical speculation, and so on. I like some consistency. I'm just speculating here.
Well, if I can make one point, the biggest advance of science was the idea that we couldn't figure out everything without looking at nature itself. And God had freedom to make nature any way he wanted to, which means if you want to find out what the universe is really like, you have to look at the universe. And I think that's the single most important foundation of science. And the corollary to that is observation trumps theory. And what that means for an idea like methodological naturalism is that unless you can establish it by observation, the observation trumps theory.
一开路半来吧。
Methodological naturalism. Using a really limited view of methodological naturalism means you have to go beyond it. Big deal.
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking of is, there are various things that have been found. Living organisms in Permian material, dinosaur bones that have apparent actual tissue still in them after supposedly millions of years. And those items have been judged by various biological and chemical criteria. And the criteria that are, the laboratory procedures assume that God isn't fooling us in our labs. And so in one sense, they're being judged by methodologically naturalistic criteria. But on another level, you can say, but we can test and see how long biological materials should last. And there's no reason to believe that they should last millions of years, let alone 65 million years. Same thing is true for carbon-14, for example. And if it's there but it's not supposed to be there, and both of those conclusions are reached by a procedure that allows methodological naturalism, then you have a conundrum. And the easy way to solve that conundrum is to simply say, well, maybe it isn't as old as it's cracked up to be. And so I see, methodological naturalism as something that is reasonable to assume as far as you can. But I think that there does come a breaking point. And when we get that breaking point, we should acknowledge it rather than trying to fight harder and harder. I think that the origin of life, for example, the field is just horribly confused. There's really no good theory of the origin of life at this point. But I don't think there's anybody that really disputes that seriously.
Precisely. And I would posit that if everybody were using a really hard-nosed version of mythological naturalism, they would be willing to say, the evidence I have only goes so far, I've got to step beyond this to put it in a context that makes sense in whatever picture they're building. I think that's honesty.
Yeah. Now, if you define science as coexistent with methodological naturalism, then what that's saying is that some evidence invites you to step outside of science. And that's legitimate. What I don't see is to say, but science is the only way to find truth. Methodological naturalism is inherent to science, and therefore creationist, intelligent design, any idea that there's a supernatural gets to be ruled out before we even start. I think that's a very poor philosophical procedure.
That's only valid if you define methodological naturalism in this very broad mechanism. In other words, they're stepping beyond the evidence to make a statement either way.
Yeah.
It occurs to me that while this discussion is dealing with intelligent design, it doesn't really, it almost sounds as if it is trying to all intelligence. But that would rule out the entire forensic science, which is specifically geared and oriented to working out who and how is it done, and who's responsible, and questions of that nature, all of which we still consider very scientific. So why is it that in that context, intelligence is admissible, but in other contexts, which we know far less about, it is not? It begins to be a bit of a puzzle. It's as if, and here's the really big conundrum. When you think about the scheme, little bit of information available on the basis of which some forensic conclusions are drawn with a great deal of confidence, and compare that the amount of information that is stored in the DNA of every cell's nucleus, and ask the simple question, how did that amount, that volume of information, that sheer enormity of information get there? And still speak of intelligence here and zero intelligence here, and consider oneself serious in this contemplation. I find this practically preposterous. It's as if one has to be a politician and not a scientist at all to be entertaining these kinds of concepts at the same time.
Did you want to say something? Sure, we'll pass it up here. Let's give him the mic here.
I'm thinking that what we have been discussing about today, about the methodological naturalism, trying to define what the scientific method means. But I think we all have summarized and agreed that the forensic science prove that the scientific method is not scientific. That's what I say.
Well, yes,
Forensic science prove that the scientific method is not scientific.
Well, certainly not scientific in that sense.
You didn't understand that? Let me say that one more time. The forensic science proves that the scientific method is not scientific.
Well, what I would rather say is that forensic science proves that the way people use methodological naturalism is not really valid. Because once you allow intelligence into some part of science, and I think forensic science is in fact science, then what it suggests is that naturalistic as opposed to intelligent causes cannot be the major dividing line. In fact, if I were to have to propose a criterion for science, I would say it is the study of the reproducible, and that allows for if a theological proposition can be shown to be reproducible, then what you have at that point is actually theology can be a science. Just a minute, we'll give it to you again.
A lot of things are not repeatable. They're observable but not repeatable. So this is where forensic science is important.
See, the example of basketball would be a wonderful thing. As a counterexample to your argument, is how do you produce the same game the same way? There's zero chance of that happening. Okay?
Creation is not repeatable.
Yeah, creation is not repeatable.
However, even some of the things,
however, if you can see creation, that is the same general type of phenomenon that is repeated in the then I think you can say that if creation is repeatable. I think that when Ellen White talks about the science of salvation, that she's not just being facetious, that she actually is talking about if certain things happen, if you surrender your life to God, or somebody else does, if there's something that happens that is reproducible in general outline. Just like if we things off of a table, it may be one ball, it may be another ball, it may be a third ball with a different density, they will follow similar projections as they fall off of the table. And it's a physics experiment that you can do, and you will find that as long as the ball's weight ratio to the resistance is small enough, that they will follow a very similar pattern. And that, of course, leads you to a natural understanding of acceleration and a law of gravitational attraction. If you repeat it on top of Mount Everest, they won't fall quite as fast, and you can actually measure that. But they will still fall, and they'll be pretty close. If you repeat it in various areas, you'll find that there's a slight variation. If you're near a mountain and so forth, they fall at a slightly different angle and so forth. But all of that, it is close enough that you can establish a kind of a general law. And if you go to the moon, which we've now done, and watch and see that the falling happens, but it happens at a different rate, and it's predictable upon the mass of the moon and the diameter of the moon, science at that point, and even though it isn't precisely reproducible, it's close enough reproducible to where it's reasonable to call it science. And for that reason, even though forensic science is perhaps not precisely reproducible in that way, there is an underlying scientific pattern to it. Methodological naturalism, in essence, is simply if it's a rule of thumb, it's a rule of saying let's ignore God inside of our laboratories, which I think is fair. If it's an absolute rule for every event in the universe, then it becomes philosophical naturalism. In fact, if not in definition. And philosophical naturalism is simply the attempt to, methodological naturalism is adopted as an absolute rule. It's basically saying if you do science, you must make atheists comfortable.
The problem with the definition of science. We inculcated into our children in this classroom to say that is the only science, that the definition of the scientific method should be revisited.
Yeah, well, the definition that was taught way back when, and that I think still has merit, is you make a hypothesis, you say what your hypothesis predicts, you go out and you test it, and then you revise your hypothesis depending on what the tests are, or maybe even throw it out, depending on how bad it is. And I think that's the strength of science. It's not that we use methodological naturalism, per se. And what's happened is that the strength of science has been kind of, if I can put it that way, hijacked to serve the purposes of excluding God from nature entirely. And I think that's wrong. Yes?
It seems to me the suggestion of methodological naturalism that it's whatever you can observe and so on. Of course, we know it's not followed, but the idea tends to prevail to a certain extent. And you can ask the question, is that not an arbitrary level at which you define science? You could redefine science as you accept only that which you can smell. And that would be an example of arbitrary definition. And I would say that methodological draws the line at a certain point which tends to exclude God. Nothing says that there's not proof beyond that. so that it is a somewhat an arbitrary line. It's a convenient one that gets rid of God. But it's certainly no criterion for finding truth.
Well, if God exists, and you say we're going to deal with something that doesn't include God, then obviously you're not dealing with all of reality. Of course, scientism kind of likes to say that science is all there is, or at least all that is important that there is. Yes.
As a non-scientist, I am having a new enlightenment about methodological naturalism today. It seems to me that all this business about the God of the gaps and how that's such a bad thing, methodological naturalism is just the flip side of that. I mean, whenever you come up against a thing that you don't understand, you just plug in your theory, and it's exactly the same thing. And how can these two sides criticize each other? I don't understand that.
Well, sometimes that's been referred to as the evolution of the gaps, which says if you can't explain it on an evolutionary basis, well, just wait, it'll get here. And really, that's basically the flip side of the God of the gaps. The question is, if you don't have all the evidence available, then are you going to assume that some God did it, or are you going to assume that there's some natural process that can explain it? And these people will say, well, you should assume that there's some natural process that can explain it. And that only works if either you know God doesn't exist, or you know God wouldn't do that. And, knowing God doesn't exist is a bit of a stretch. And knowing that God wouldn't do that, in my opinion, is even more of a stretch, especially when most of the people who do this would admit that Jesus was resurrected. So God does step into history. So why can't he step into prehistory? Yeah.
Whenever there is some kind of interaction between unequals, there is always lots of opportunity for plenty of misunderstanding and misconstruing and misinterpretation and such like. The Old Testament is rife with it. When Israelites were going through the desert, they had the pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night, and yet they clamored at Moses as if it was Moses' fault that whatever happened. They had repeated uprisings against Moses, as if he is the one who's guiding the pillar of cloud or fire, either way. No amount of evidence was sufficient to dissuade them from their convictions in the matter. And no outcome was sufficient to change their view of things. Whether God himself intervened and proved the matter or not, they still blame Moses. Isn't that an interesting observation? So the question that arises in circumstances is, why is that the case? We have similar situations sometimes as a student and mentor. And you look at what's going on and you think, so a mentor's patience is interpreted by a student as, he hasn't done enough for me. And if the mentor really does intervene, or you try to dictate to me, I mean, is there... And so will happen. But there is no a priori guarantee that any one intervention, however well intentioned, is going to have that outcome. And this is true with students, with younger people, as well as older people. When we are determined to see things a certain way, we can always find a justification for continuing in our viewpoint, no matter what evidence is there to contradict it. And that is the frightening thing. If I recall a passage from the first chapter in Patriarchs and Prophets, it talks about how Jesus tried to counsel Lucifer while there was still an opportunity for him to avoid the, shall we say, the ultimate downfall. And all the kindness and courtesy and care with which Christ tried to counsel with him, Lucifer interpreted as weakness. This whole thing doesn't add up to much. I can really prove that I'm strong enough to accomplish what I aim to accomplish. It is fascinating how things can be interpreted when one is willing to interpret them a certain way.
Well, you see this kind of thing in the history of Elijah. He's just done a demonstration that the Lord is God, that the people accepted, and Jezebel's reaction is not to say, oh, you had it right after all. It is to say, no, you're going to be dead man by tomorrow.
Right, by definition.
Right? And the same thing is true of Jesus and his resurrection. Yes. The temple guard, it was probably the temple guard, not actually Roman soldiers that made the guard at the tomb, because they reported to the high priest. And there was such a thing as temple guard. And that's why when Pilate said something that can be interpreted both ways. It's probably best interpreted. So you have a guard, make it safe as you can. So the temple guard comes back to them. And even if it was Roman soldiers, somebody came back to them and said, look, this is what happened. And the high priest, instead of saying, oh no, we goofed it, he really is the Messiah, they go, listen, just tell everybody the disciples came and stole the body. You're just going, obviously, these people are not about to let a few facts get in the way of their theory. And if there's anything that science has to say, it is that you better let the facts get in the way of your theory.
That's right. That's the true science.
Otherwise, you won't find the right theory.
Yeah. So what basis on that?
Just a minute. Let's get your comment, because I can't hear it. I'm not quite as good at hearing as I used to be. So
on the basis of that statement, does science have need of God? Does God have a place in science? If it's fact-based, can we ever prove or disprove his existence?
If we wish to continue learning.
So if it's observation-based, then we operate on, I at least operate on the perception that we don't seek to understand him, but we can never fully understand him because he's just above us, beyond us. Is it wrong that we exclude the search for God from our scientific pursuits?
Well, as we'll talk about next week, there's actually two ways of doing this. One of them is to say science is a limited enterprise and it doesn't involve God. But in that case, one has to say, well, science is a limited enterprise, and if God exists, we're going to have to move beyond science in order to understand all the truth. The other way of saying it is that true science will go after the truth regardless, and therefore will be open to evidence for God. And either one of those will allow you to find truth, either admitting the limitations of science or defining science in such a way that it can, in fact, interact with every other form of knowledge. In which case, I personally prefer the latter, to say that science is not completely closed off from everything else. That's why the failure of the demarcation criteria that's been noticed by philosophers of science for a long time. And so if it is open to the possibility of God, then it has to be a little bit careful about what it dictates in terms of the possibilities. Well, I think that's probably enough for today, and I'm going to encourage you to come back for next week for the second part of this, where it will be approached in a slightly different way, but the names will change, but the entities will remain the same. Evolution critique, science needs philosophy. We've been studying the book Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. The editors, you'll notice one of them is J.P. Moreland, and today's chapter will be by him. First, I will point out that this book has a very specific aim. If you are dividing the way people look at origins into groups, you can have what I would call young life creationism, because young life, but old earth belongs in this category. At least in my opinion, that's what is commonly known as old earth, but which should probably be called old life creationism. There is theistic evolution that is ID friendly, and in 2 weeks we're going to have that line very precisely drawn. And then there is theistic evolution that is not intelligent design friendly. And the way that this is done, the difference, just very briefly, is can you tell by looking at the world around you, or is everything exactly the way atheism would presume, which was, of course, the last alternative. The book, as the title implies, really doesn't primarily aim at atheistic evolution, although, of course, atheistic evolution takes its lumps. It's precisely aimed at the theistic evolution that you cannot tell that God is involved. We believe that by faith. There's no real evidence. And I don't like that definition of faith, but that's the way it's often used. This chapter, again, is by J.P. Moreland, and it is in Section 2. This is the beginning of Section 2, the philosophical critique of theistic evolution. Why Science Needs Philosophy is the title of this chapter, which is intended to be an introduction to the rest of the chapter. The summary of the chapter starts, we shall explore two philosophical theses from philosopher George Beeler that illuminate ways in which philosophy is relevant to science, especially to the debate about theistic evolution versus intelligent design. Number one, the autonomy of philosophy. Among the central questions of philosophy that can be answered by one standard theoretical means or another, most can in principle be answered by philosophical investigation and argument without relying substantively on the sciences. We don't need science for many questions, and some important ones. The second point he wants to make is that the authority of philosophy, insofar as science and philosophy purport to answer the same central philosophical questions, in most cases the support that science could in principle provide for those answers is not as strong as that which philosophy could in principle provide for its answers. So should there be conflicts, the authority of philosophy in most cases can be greater in principle. And he's quoting, and we're going to run into those two in just a little bit. The autonomy of philosophy refers to areas of philosophical investigation that lie completely outside the competence of science. The authority of philosophy refers to areas in which both science and philosophy investigate, where the philosophical factors carry more weight than and trump those of science. I list key examples of both that are relevant to setting the intellectual context for debating the relative merits of theistic evolution versus intelligent design. I will comment on that later. I have a little trouble with the authority of philosophy in particular, but we'll get to that later. Now, we're going to start the chapter itself. People sometimes ask, what does Athens' reason have to do with Jerusalem? Meaning faith. The implied answer is usually nothing. In my correct view, the answer is plenty. Correct answer is plenty. But I cannot defend that claim here. Similarly, many people, especially maybe most scientists, ask, what does philosophy, idle speculation, have to do with science, which secures hard facts about reality? Again, the usual answer is nothing. But nothing could be further from the truth. Science and philosophy have interacted and do interact with each other in a number of ways that, in the normal course of science education and practice, are sadly not made available to scientists themselves. In this introduction to Section 2, the philosophical critique of theistic evolution, I shall focus on two philosophical theses that illuminate ways in which philosophy is relevant to science, especially to the debate about theistic evolution versus intelligent design. Here are the two theses stated clearly by philosopher George Beeler, and those are verbatim from before, so we'll not read them again. And the reference is given in reference 1. To illustrate briefly, the autonomy of philosophy refers to areas of philosophical investigation, that is, debates about abstract objects, different interpretations of modal logic, the relative merits of utilitarian versus virtue ethics, that lie completely outside the competence of science. The authority of philosophy refers to areas in which both science and philosophy investigate. For example, the nature of time, the question of whether unobservable theoretical entities of scientific theories exist, or are useful fictions, which is an important point we'll come back to later, where the philosophical factors carry more weight than and trump those of science. In what follows, I shall list key examples of both that are relevant to setting the intellectual context for debating the relative merits of theistic evolution versus intelligent design. Remember, that's precisely that question of can you tell that God did it? Well, to be precise, intelligent design does not necessarily say that God did it, but most intelligent design people are in fact believers in the divine. Starting with the principle of authority. Examples of the principle of authority. Example 1, Stephen Hawking and the beginning of the universe. In the past few decades, there has been a stunning revival of an argument for God's existence from the fact that the universe had a beginning. The argument, called the Kalam cosmological argument, is in fact many centuries old, but it has been given new strength and clarity in recent times. For our purposes, there are four arguments for the universe as having a beginning: the impossibility of an actual infinite set of concrete entities such as events, the impossibility of traversing an actual infinite series of events by successive addition, the standard Big Bang model, and the second law of thermodynamics. Most of those who say that the universe did have a beginning hold the first two philosophical arguments to carry more weight than the last two scientific arguments. And thus, on the assumption that arguments for and against this claim are themselves philosophical, this seems to be a clear example of the authority's thesis that philosophy carries more weight than science. In his book, A Brief History of Time, Hawking develops a no-boundary model of the beginning of the universe, and he uses imaginary time, multiples of the square root of -1, to avoid a cosmological singularity, or an absolute beginning, to retain a finite past, and to depict the initial segment of space-time as rounded off, very much like the South Pole being the beginning of the Earth, and various circles of latitude playing the role of time itself. Just as you cannot ask what is south of the South Pole, you cannot ask what was before the rounded-off section of the initial segment of space-time. So there is no need for a beginning, yet the past is finite. Now, if you're going, what? You're in good company. Philosophers, especially philosophers of science, have responded to Hawking in two ways. First, the philosophical support for the cosmological argument's first premise, the universe had a beginning, is stronger than the support for Hawking's model, so one should still believe in a beginning. Second, because Hawking's model employs imaginary time, a notion that is literally, conceptually unintelligible if taken to depict reality as it really is, the model should be understood in an anti-realist instrumentalist or positivist way, as a useful fiction, rather than a realist way, as an actual depiction of the real world. But of course, if you interpret science that way, then the whole point of what Hawking says disappears. Hawking admits that his model is nothing but a useful fiction, and that he himself is an anti-realist, a positivist, and an instrumentalist. But these notions are not scientific ones, and in fact cannot be found in purely scientific writings. I mean, how would you empirically test those concepts? Thus, for Hawking to know the meaning of these notions and explicitly identify his views with them, he had to do some reading in the philosophy of science, or at least some thinking in the philosophy of science. Why? Because these viewpoints are labeled as philosophical in nature, and the field that has developed and debated them is philosophy, not science. So in order for Hawking to express the real implications of his model, he had to turn to philosophy, not to science. As a result, this nicely illustrates the authority of philosophy. This is an odd result, since Hawking claims that philosophy is dead, and yet he must turn to philosophy in a foundational way to express how he understands his own model. And Hawking has said that philosophy is dead. Thus, it was the discipline of philosophy that both placed Hawking's model in the classification to which it belongs, and continued to show that his model did nothing whatsoever to undermine belief in the universe's beginning. Certainly not in real time, as opposed to imaginary time. Example 2, Stephen Hawking's on the universe coming to be from nothing. In The Grand Design, Hawking and his co-author Leonard Mlodinow claim that quantum physics has made the need for a creator and designer superfluous. This is because the universe can create itself, that is, it came into existence out of nothing. This claim upset the faith of a number of believers because it was the considered judgment of a scientist, indeed one of the top living scientists. But alas, Hawking and Mlodinow may well be great scientists, but they're very poor philosophers. Why? Because their concept of nothing is not the same as the philosophical one, and the philosophical notion is a relevant one in deciding on the need for a creator. For Hawking and Mlodinow, nothing means a quantum vacuum which contains energy and is itself located in space. The universe comes into being spontaneously as a fluctuation of the energy in the vacuum. Which vacuum? Unfortunately, this is hardly a case of a universe coming into being from nothing. The philosophical notion of nothing is just that, the complete and total lack of any being whatsoever, including the absence of particles, causal powers, fields, properties, and so on, including the vacuum field, by the way. Given this notion of nothing, it becomes self-evident that necessarily something cannot come from nothing without a cause, because there's nothing to come from. In this example, the philosophical considerations carry more weight than do the scientific claims. Example 3, the origin of life. There's been a long-running debate as to whether or not we can discover a reasonable